Do we have inequality here in the United States? I see some yeses, any no's. All right, this is one of the problems that's been happening really for the last 40 years. There was a period after World War II where we had a growing middle class, rising standards of living, but really in the late 70s and the early 80s that took a downturn. And while the economy continues to grow, the middle class has started shrinking, and salaries have sort of stagnated. A lot of the best jobs have gone overseas, a lot of the industrial jobs. At first, it looked like we were transitioning from an industrial economy to a service economy, but then a lot of the services went overseas as well, and it's not clear exactly what kind of economy we have left, except for we can see in the economy a great deal of inequality. What's been happening here since the 1970s, the top 1% has, of course, gained enormously in income, whereas before that was just the opposite. We were seeing the middle class rising, and the difference between the top and the bottom was shrinking. If you take the highest fifth, there's still a 100% increase from 79 to 2007. This is kind of an old slide. But what's happening in the bottom part? What if you're in the lowest fifth? It looks like very modest gains, right? But are those gains? Well, it turns out if you factor in things like inflation, it looks like this. Those very modest or level gains aren't actually keeping up with things like inflation. If you look at household incomes and adjust for inflation, household income has actually been dropping pretty dramatically, actually losing ground to things like inflation. So fundamentally, over the last 40 years, the very wealthy have been getting wealthier, the poorer have been getting relatively poorer, and the middle class, for the first time in the history of the United States, is shrinking. Or I should say since World War II. So we're seeing a sort of hourglass arrangement. Instead of a growing middle class, we're looking at a shrinking middle class and a bifurcation of the economy. As you know, the jobs in investment, banking, insurance, the fire, what they call the fire sector, that's all booming. We become basically a finance and banking economy. And if you're an investor, an owner, and you're holding equities, this is working for you. If you are not, as they say, in an equity position, if you don't own anything, then the tax structure, the economy doesn't work for you. If I own a business, I get to write that off on my taxes. My dad was very proud to say he never paid taxes for 10 solid years. Because if you own stuff, you can move things around to avoid taxes. Do you guys own your home? Too bad. I do. I get to write that off. It's a tax write-off. Owning things. That's what this, economy is targeted at. This is who it's designed to help, is the owners of things, whether it be stocks or real estate or businesses. Everyone else has been feeling a pinch. And this doesn't look good. I don't imagine this looks good to you.
Sorry, I just don't understand. So you don't pay property taxes like 10% on what's your house worth?
Wealthy people hardly pay any tax. The businesses hardly pay any tax. Lots of the biggest businesses don't pay any tax. Haven't for years. So the government started out setting up these programs to encourage investments. They don't want all the money just sitting in the bank. So they'll offer you a tax break to invest your money. They'll offer you a tax break if you buy new machinery for your factory. I mean, how many of us own factories anymore? But new machinery could then be depreciated and written off as annual losses for your investment. The problem is that these tax loopholes for investment became so great that basically, if you're a business person or a wealthy person and you're paying taxes, it's because you're not paying attention on how to use these rules. It's very relatively easy to avoid taxes if you know how to do it. And you hire a tax person to tell you. So while we have nominally these high tax brackets that are amongst the highest in the world, actually if you look at what wealthy people are paying and what large corporations are actually paying net, it's very, very low, much lower than most other countries. But they'll yell about the high tax bracket. Right? Now, this doesn't look good. We can agree on that. But it's way worse than this. There are huge losses behind this that are not calculated in. And you're not aware of what you have lost. Some of the things that you've lost I have mentioned. It's in this period we went from a single income family to a dual income family. During this period, this is when women re-entered the workforce en masse. So what's hidden behind here is that household income is now basically dual income, and it isn't keeping up. The idea that you used to have one income, one breadwinner and a parent that stayed home and raised the kids, that got burned in the process. When my dad, we had 6 kids in the family, when he was raising his family, there was a reasonable expectation that his children would go to college. And I'm sorry if I ran this one on you before, but what did Professor McCarty pay per unit to go to college? Did I ask you guys this? I ask almost every class. Take a wild guess as to what I paid per unit to go to college in California. I'm giving it away because it's California. Right? $5 a unit. Like, what? In the 1960s, everyone got in their car, they left Detroit, they drove down Route 66, and they came to California to go to college. All of them. I know this because my sister married a guy from Detroit. And all these people from Detroit just come out of the woodwork. Like the whole state of, came down, drove down Route 66. But everybody came to California. And so you've got Berkeley and the UC system and a whole bunch of Cal States. And this whole thing was built up because it was nearly free. Very inexpensive. This was a commitment to public education. It's part of why California's economy boomed and why California was, the Golden West and the place to be. These were almost all the colleges were military bases that were converted from military bases to colleges all up and down California. At UCSB, for example, you could still see the old Quonset huts and military buildings. Your fairgrounds were all what? Airfields from World War II. But these were converted en masse into colleges and fairgrounds, and the whole world came to college in California. And you get Berkeley in the 60s and the whole hippie movement, right? But at the time that my dad was raising his children on a bachelor's degree and one income, he had a reasonable expectation that all of his children would be able to go to college. At that time, California school system was ranked one of the best in the nation. K through 12, where does California rank now? 30 something? Lower.
45?
It's like 46, 47. We're down there with Louisiana and Alabama in school system rank. This was, for me and my wife, we're both educators, this was a problem. The California school system, when I went through it, started to crash. When did the California school system start to crash? Why? What did it? Prop 13. The landowners decided we're not paying to school all these immigrant children, all of these foreigners coming into California, and so they cut property taxes, which was the funding for the schools, in half. And from that moment until now, California K through 12 has been going in the toilet. Really remarkable dive from being one of the best systems in the country to one of the worst. So, sorry, I'm punching way too many buttons. At this time, my father, and frankly I, have a retirement program tied to my employment. Are you going to have a retirement program tied to your employment? What about health care? Used to be health care was provided by the employer. What does it cost to pay for health care right now? If you have to pay for it on your own, you're going to be looking at $800 or $1,000 a month. It's outrageous. Don't have children. They cost too much. I'm kidding. Kids are great, but they cost too much. So what's gone here? What about job security? When I was going through school, they were saying, well, you know, you've lost the job security of your parents. You're going to have maybe 3 or 4 careers in your lifetime. Then it went to 5, and then it went to 7, and then it went to 9. 9 different careers isn't a career. A career is where, like my dad, you get a degree in engineering and you work your whole life as an engineer. That's called a career. There's a difference between a career and a job. How many jobs are you guys slated to have? Sorry, gigs. How many gigs are you guys slated to have? I don't know the answer to this one. I'm pretty sure you all don't know either. I'm not sure anyone knows. You're just going to have to try and piece together a living out of multiple gigs. And maybe you could be an Uber driver while you work at the pizza parlor and, you know, freelance on the side. I don't know what it's going to look like. But job security is one of the things that went down and was taken down intentionally. A huge portion of the population got moved into precariat status. You don't know if you're going to be employed. You don't know if you're going to have health care. You don't know if you're going to have a retirement. How much money do you have to save to retire? Go back to my dad, raised in the Depression. If I told him that he was going to need more than $1 million in the bank to retire, say in 1940, what would he have done about it? He would have laughed at me. $1 million bucks? You got to be kidding. You know, I'm talking about a time gas was 19 cents a gallon, and a hamburger cost you 25 cents. It was a different world. But if you told him that he needed $1 million to retire, back when he retired, He would have A, laughed at you, and B, what could he have done about it? So right now to retire, what do you need? How much money you got to put in the bank to retire?
Around 2 million?
Sorry?
Around 2 million?
Around 2 million. Depends on how long you think your retirement's going to be. People are living longer. Maybe if you retire at 65, could be 30 years. If you're looking at 30 years, I don't know if 2 million's going to do it. Average cost of a house in Irvine is, oh yeah, way too much. If you own your home, then retirement math gets a little bit easier to work out. You can do it without taking off your shoes and counting on your toes. But if you don't own your home, retirement starts to look complicated and very, very expensive. So it's hard to even know what kind of money you would have now to retire. In 40 years, when you get ready to retire, what's that number going to be? Sorry?
6, 7.
6, 7. If you were a reasonable person right now trying to predict what retirement's going to look like 40 years from now, you'd be looking, you'd project at probably 10 million and you might fall short. What you do is you shift into assets. Assets aren't subject in the same way. Right? If you bought a house, okay, our house in Laguna Beach in 1970s was $46,000. That's what we sold that house for. I am still kicking my own ass about that. And I was just a kid. Okay? The numbers all keep going up, but assets tend to hold their value. That's why being in an asset position is kind of nice. Because what's happening is the money is becoming less valuable. The hamburger went from 25 cents to $2.50 to $5, right? And the Coke went from 5 cents to 50 cents to, well, I don't know, you guys are paying $3 or $4 for a bottle of water out of the, I don't get $3 water. This is not something that I can cope with, right? $3 or $4 for a bottle of anything to drink sounds extraordinary. But behind this, there are huge standard of living sorts of losses. Are you going to even be able to buy a home? Probably some of you. How many of you are going to end up professionals with the kind of income that's going to allow you to buy a home and retire? Statistically, a pretty small slice. You're talking about being in the, top 10% to pull that off. You're not going to do it working over there at Chick-fil-A, just to be clear. So this is the picture. Here we are in 1940, right? Great Depression's coming to an end. One of the things that happened in World War II was a lot of money got pumped into the economy and industry, and so the economy grew. But after the end of the war, what this is measuring is the difference in pay between the top executives and the average worker. A measurement of inequality. During this period, through the 1960s and into the 1970s, right about here, we see the nadir or the low point of inequality in the United States. This is where the average worker and the top executive were making relatively close to the same amount of money. Something happens. Whatever we were doing over here that grew this middle class, that's what we're looking at here, is a growing middle class, right? Decreasing inequality and a growing middle class. And inequality takes off. And it goes through the roof. What happened? Middle class starts shrinking, inequality takes off. Keep in mind, the economy's growing the whole time. The economy is, since the Great Depression, has been on a steady upswing. This is not a measure of economic activity. The economy right now is 10 times bigger than the economy was when we built all these schools and the entire freeway system. The economy was a fraction the size of it is now. When school was cheap, everyone could go to school and we were building infrastructure. But we've lost the belief that we can build infrastructure and send people to school, even though the economy has grown tenfold. What was this change? By the way, it's time.
I think, I mean, I don't know what you guys believe, but I think from my understanding, like, the law was changed, allowing, I guess, like, things like stock buybacks to be legal.
Stock buybacks, law changes. There were several legal changes in there.
Yeah, like, and like, I know one of them was the one about, like, stock buybacks where CEOs were, they could artificially inflate things like their stock prices, and also they got incentives to increase their stuff because they get bonuses and things like that. There was something about like a set of laws that was passed.
There are several things, banking regulations, investment regulations. It used to be that when you put money in the bank, they couldn't take that money and invest it in the stock market, which is basically a form of gambling. But that law changed. CEOs started to give themselves really huge bonuses, right? And CEO pay took off from the average worker pay. But what was the fundamental change that allowed that? This is my problem, is you guys don't know. You don't know what it was, what the economic system was that created this lowering inequality and the increasing middle class, and you don't really know the name of what came in and replaced it and caused inequality to start increasing. There's an economic ideology that kicked in here. Yes, the answer is yes, neoliberalism. This is Reagan, Thatcher, neoliberalism, deregulation, austerity kind of thinking. Okay. Where government's bad, services like education should be privatized, right? And businesses should be deregulated. And if CEOs can make 100 times more than the average worker, then that's fine, right? So the changes that we're talking about in the shrinking middle class, this is called neoliberalism. It's what came in. Can you tell me what it replaced? Does anybody know what came before neoliberalism? Any econ majors in here, they're going to know this. Keynesianism. Right? Before this, before the Great Depression, in the 1920s basically, Keynes came to prominence as the economic guru that said, hey, we have to invest in the economy, we need to provide services, the government has a role in providing things like retirement and education. Government's not bad, government's part of the solution. And those policies, like public education and whatnot, led to a decrease in inequality and a growing middle class. But then we changed it in the late 70s. Milton Friedman, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, neoliberalism comes in, and we start to see this increasing inequality. So the kind of growth that we're seeing in the top, folks might be leaving. You're welcome to go and join the protest if you want. the kind of growth that we're seeing in the top 1% in corporations and investments and profits, with a booming economy right now, record stock prices, the problem is that that wealth isn't translating into middle class income. And in our system, the capitalist system, the goose that lays the golden egg, that's the middle class. If you don't have a middle class that can buy cars and washers and dryers and other durable goods and take vacations and do all that, then the fundamentals of a consumer economy falls apart. And so the growth that we're seeing all being at the top means that, there's an increasing number of Italian yachts being sold, super high-end luxury products. I don't know, have you noticed all the, McLarens driving around and the Ferraris and the Bentleys and, all of that? That side of the market's doing well. But at the middle class range, we're not seeing sustainable growth. We're seeing a market that services the top 1%. I have several articles on the website about this. Wrong button. It turns out that what's happening here in the United States is happening abroad. The same policies, neoliberal policies, that are leading to inequality here in the United States are, through the WTO and the World Bank and all of that, being imposed on the rest of the world, and they're increasing inequality abroad as well. It has become what's called the Washington Consensus, and because the United States exerts such a tremendous amount of influence over the UN, the WTO, and the World Bank, and this ideology of, shrinking governments, shrinking public services, less healthcare, less education, more investment, more big business. This ideology has gone global. Not so long ago, the wealthiest entities on the planet were all countries. The United States, China, Russia, these were the wealthiest entities. The list of the 100 wealthiest entities was populated almost entirely by nations. But this is no longer the case. Right at the moment, only a handful of countries, the biggest economies, are still on the list. And major multinational corporations now populate the rest of the list. Elon Musk, that did Tesla, right, and several other business ventures, borrowed a bunch of money to make Tesla happen. How much money did he borrow? He borrowed an amount greater than the entire gross national product of Greece. He himself. You're talking about individuals and corporations that are now wealthier than most of the countries on the planet. This is an extraordinary concentration of wealth. Unfortunately, new technologies coming in, you think, okay, well, the internet's going to level everything out and balance the playing field. There was the articles about it becoming a flat earth because people in Africa would be able to do technological innovation just as easily as people in the United States. That turned out to be largely a load of hooey. Technologies like Google and Amazon and other such have concentrated wealth even further. Other companies, smaller companies, are having trouble competing against these giant, e-commerce giants. It's very difficult to open up a retail shop or a bookshop and go toe-to-toe with Amazon. All the publishers, academic publishers that I deal with in my career, having a hard time because Amazon has such a huge weight in the market, and they've started to publish, right? So they're sort of driving prices down so that publishers are having trouble staying afloat. You see retail stores, empty retail stores in places like South Coast Plaza and Fashion Island. Why? Because it's too easy to go on Amazon and go clickety, 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 which is what I do. And boxes start showing up on your doorstep. And then my teenagers get on Amazon and they can click even faster than I can, which is sort of terrifying. And more boxes show up. This is good for the environment. It's an enormous amount of packaging. You know, you get a tube of toothpaste, comes in a box like this with enough bubble wrap to land, you know, something on another planet safely. You know, it's just insane. But I'm there buying stuff online as well. But it's collapsing local retail. We used to call this the Walmart effect. Small town with a, you know, shoe store and a clothing store and a butcher and a small grocery store, and you drop a Walmart into the small town, what happens to all those local businesses? They got to fold because they can't compete with Walmart. Everybody's out of work, they go to work for Walmart. Walmart pays like below minimum wage and doesn't pay full-time employees. They specifically avoid full-time employees so they don't have to provide benefits. They put out, at one point, Walmart put out a memo that their employees should get on welfare if they can't make ends meet. And so all over the United States, you see these little towns with nothing but a Walmart, and half the people that are employed in the town are working at Walmart. But then Walmart's now getting its ass kicked. The huge bookstores, Borders, Barnes and Noble, that came in and shut down all the local bookstores and overpowered them and put them on, they got put out of business. You know, they were the big fish that gobbled up all the little fish, and then they got gobbled up. And there's no more Borders, right? And so we're not looking at a spreading out of wealth, we're looking at a concentration of wealth. This is Nelson Mandela. Poverty is not an accident like slavery and apartheid. It's man-made and can be removed by the actions of humans. Neoliberalism, and in large part economics, will tell you that, well, the economy just operates naturally. Inequality is natural. Some people win, some people lose. Who are the winners? Who wins the game?
Whoever exploits the other person.
Whoever exploits the other person most. What do they look like? Pudgy, middle-aged, balding, white males that wear purple shirts. Sorry? Jeff Bezos. Right. Bezos. Zuckerman. We're talking about white males that are overly educated, come from rich families. That's the easiest way to make $1 million, is the old joke. Inherit 999,000. That's the easiest way to make $1 million. It seems like fair competition, except for the same people keep winning. If I take a picture of Congress right now, what does it look like?
White.
Really, really shockingly white, not just in skin color, but in hair color. These are really old white guys. Very few women. In fact, a shrinking number of women in Congress in certain parties. Not a growing number, shrinking number of women. Older, more white-haired guys. That's what we need, is more old white-haired guys running the country, right? Well, this is the difference. We like to talk about inequality like it's natural. It falls like rain It's not anybody's fault. It's not the result of policies that we are implementing. It's not the result of an education system that discriminates at every single level. I'm an ex-cop. I don't know if you guys know this, but I was a cop back in the 80s. And I can tell you that the criminal system discriminates at every stage. Every single stage. Where they used to send me to patrol in the patrol car was discriminatory. Who we patrol, who gets stopped, whether or not they're cited, whether or not they're arrested, whether or not they're released on bail, whether or not they're convicted, how long their sentence is, whether or not they get out released on good, all these things are massively, measurably discriminated. Got 50 years of social sciences being really clear that this is racially, class-wise. It's like in the criminal system. What's your chances of getting executed if you're a white person? Have we ever executed a rich white person in the United States? I don't actually know the answer to that one. Well, maybe we did somewhere, but poor people of color, we're executing in the 20, 30 a month. There are states like Texas that can't execute minorities fast enough. There's a bunch of states in the South, when they found out that genetic tests might actually free certain people on bogus rape charges, what did they do? They threw away all the evidence so that those cases could not be retried. The genetic evidence from those cases was dumped so that those people couldn't be freed. I'm talking about structural racism, structural inequality that's not accidentally produced. The people that go to Ivy League schools are not accidentally produced. If you're from a West Coast school, are you likely to get into Harvard? Where do Harvard people come from? Overwhelmingly, they come from a handful of prep schools, mostly on the East Coast. Everybody knows who these really expensive elite prep schools are. And if you want a reasonable chance of getting into an Ivy League school, you go there and you put your child into one of the prep schools that has a reputation for getting these kids into Ivy League schools. Otherwise, it's a total crapshoot. And your chances of going Ivy League are pretty slim. Remember, you come out of a K-12 system that's ranked 48th in the nation. They going to take you seriously? There'll be exceptions. Some people will get in. I'm talking about overwhelmingly, statistically, the wealthy stay wealthy and the poor stay poor. There are your Michael Jackson, sorts of exceptions to this, but it is the exceptions that prove the rule. They are statistically insignificant, these exceptions. But we love the exceptions. We love to talk about people that pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and made it despite all odds. But that just hides behind it the overwhelming statistical fact that the poor will stay poor and the rich will stay rich. So we need to change our approach to development models. We need to return to the issue of poverty. This is a very 1960s sort of idea. We prefer to talk about inequality. Okay. Inequality isn't caused by anything, it just happens. Poverty, for me, originally was seen as a causal problem. We used to try to deal with poverty because poverty caused other problems. It wasn't just some effect. Poverty creates other problems. Lower lifespan, crime, whatever else you want to attribute to it, all right? But we need, what Mandela's talking about in that quote is an understanding that poverty is created and recreated continually by a system that isn't accidental. It has, for hundreds of years, produced wealth for certain people and poverty for others. And this has implications for the long-term stability of the geopolitical system. This used to be kind of a far-off thing when I would give this lecture, but it should be getting a little closer to you now, and understanding that the world can go unstable. It can descend into chaos and violence with everybody looking after themselves. 30 or 40 years ago, that seemed like a far-off thing. Europe and the US, the Western Alliance, it looked like democracy was going to win. And democracy's sort of teetering and hanging on by a thread at this point. We're seeing the spread of authoritarianism in places where we shouldn't be seeing it. In places where the last time this happened, it went really, really bad. So, it should get up, kind of in your face. And you got to sort of come to grips with the fact that we can't just ignore the rest of the world and think we're going to be safe. We have to actually do something. When we think about development, we like to think about the BRIC countries, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China. These are the darlings of development. There's growing economies. China's been hugely successful. Russia's been having more trouble recently. You'll notice this is an old one, and I like it because it also used to include South Africa. This used to be BRICS with an S on it for South Africa. We don't talk about South Africa as much here in the United States. But development is happening in these countries. But what this hides is a whole world of places that are not developing. You have the G8, you got the G20, right? Countries that are driving the global economy. But there's 194 countries in the world, give or take, depending on which island you count, 193, 194. The smallest countries have like 10,000 people in them, right? You're talking about specific islands at that point. But something like 194 countries in the world. And here we are focused on 4 of them. What's behind that? Well, this is Paul Collier's work. He came to the UC, did a talk that was very influential on me, did a book in 2007 called The Bottom Billion. Hidden behind all the talk of the BRICS and the development paradigm and all the money that's being made by major corporations, the bottom 1/6 of the world's population, 1 billion or so people, are living in poverty, total poverty. We're talking $1 or $2 a day they're living on as a rough equivalency. And this is not randomly distributed. There's about 58 of the poorest countries in the world, and they're not just scattered around. They tend to be concentrated in poor sections of the world and be grouped together. Most of them in sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia, where you have huge numbers. Collier didn't want to actually name the countries because there's a problem with labeling. If you name a country as a failed state or as a bottom billion, what happens? No investment. The world just walks away and says, oh, that's a failed state. and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is the problem with labeling people, corporations, countries, right? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we name them all loser countries, well then, it's going to happen. But it's not hard to know who the 58 countries Collier was talking about. One of the poorest nations in the world, Afghanistan. One of the countries that we are actively bombing like mad. One of the poorest places in the world. Bolivia, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Nepal, Rwanda, Somalia, Uganda. What does this list remind you of? Professor McCarty's decolonization list. Sorry? Third world countries, global south, developing countries. We got all kinds of names. These are the former colonies that, have been struggling since, well, Christopher Columbus in one way or another. You can look where the people are that are living on less than $1.25 a day. Huge numbers of them in India, in China, but countries like Nigeria, huge population, huge amounts of poverty. Bangladesh, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Tanzania. Giant populations. Some of these populations dwarf the United States. There are countries out there with more poor people in them than there are people in the United States. They got more hairdressers than people in the United States. We are far from being the most populous country. Right? But what Collier is arguing is that poverty is concentrated in places geographically. It's not random. Some countries, the BRIC countries, are developing. These bottom billion countries that Collier's talking about aren't modernizing. They aren't developing. They're not converging with the first world. Remember, that was the point of the development paradigm, was to pull the third world into the first world, right? So they didn't become communists, right? Well, that's not happening. We're not looking at convergence, we're looking at divergence. Yes, there was a movie titled Divergence recently. They haven't been converging for, I should change that now, 40 or 50 years. This isn't some new little quirk or phase. Some of these countries have been mired in civil war for this long. They're not catching up, right? They're stuck. They aren't going to fix themselves. This is very clear. The world needs to do something because this problem ain't getting better the way we're going about things now. And this is the argument Collier's making, that we need to look at the worst cases. Back in the day, they talked about total quality management, and there was this idea of the tail of the dragon, right? Here's a normal curve, normal distribution, right? If you want to move the average, what's the easiest way to improve the average score of kids in a class, for example? The tail of the dragon. You come way out here and you get the outliers, the worst cases. And if you can push them into the middle, then the middle moves. You can try to move the mass of the middle, but if you just move the outliers that are really well below average, you can increase the average much more easily, much more effectively. Who are the outliers here? The bottom billion. You want to deal with poverty, one of the best ways to do it is work in the worst case scenarios, to deal with the $1.25 a day and below people. This is how you move the average up. We like to use these ideas in business, but we don't like to apply them in the real world. Right? The worst cases of the bottom billion are countries and regions of the world that are falling farther behind. They are mired in endless civil war, ethnic conflict, genocide. They're spiraling into chaos. We name them failed states, or they're on the verge of failing. They're going authoritarian. They're moving away from democracy to elect authoritarian leaders in some cases. But instead of dealing with this, we tend to walk away. We call them, corrupt, failed states, and we let them fail. We're letting a huge portion of the world just spiral into chaos like it's far away, like it's not going to impact us. And we do like to think of the bottom billion or of the third world as being way far away. But this is one of the things that globalization has done. First and third world is no longer, over here and over there. In Europe, you're seeing wealth and extreme poverty side by side. In the United States, it's astounding the incredible wealth you can have on one side of the street and the incredible poverty on the other side of the street. And on one side of the boulevard, it's Beverly Hills. On the other side of the street, it's East LA. It doesn't even have like the old traditional divisions of the wrong side of the railroad tracks or upriver, downriver. The wealthy people used to live high on the hill and the other people had to live down below. Those were at least geographic divisions. LA is this incredible patchwork of zip codes, and if you're on the wrong side of one street, house prices change, incomes change. It's like a different world and a totally artificial dividing line. So the third world isn't safely out there somewhere. It's not like, coronavirus is only going to happen over there somewhere. We are not separated from this in any way. It's not out there somebody else's problem. It's all coming home to roost, and very quickly. So, I want to show this Collier video if I can, but I want you to look for the idea of trickle down or trickle over. We like to think in modern economics that wealth from very wealthy people trickles down to the poor people. There's very little evidence that this is what happens. Rich people tend to keep their money, poor people tend to stay poor. But one of the things that's really not happening is that wealth from one country isn't trickling over and down to another country. That is not happening in the system. Thick and thin development. When we talk about thick development, development's the kind of thing where you go in and you do a project that helps the locals, maybe some technology transfer. Local people get to know how to do jobs, they get employment, and it leads to development in the local area. Thin development is where you go in, you mine all the minerals, and you leave. The money doesn't stay locally. It doesn't stay on the ground. It doesn't come out of the ground in terms of oil and stay right there on top of the ground in terms of resources. Thin development displaces people, causes a lot of pollution, and then moves away without helping the local people or economy. We're talking about a top-down multinational corporation kind of business that only wants to look at economic activity. Increased economic activity is a good thing. But is it a good thing if all the increased economic activity turns out to be profit that goes into my pocket? These macroeconomic terms like increased economic activity don't tell you whose pocket the money's going into. They don't say who's the winners and who's the losers. Just the economy's working. They never want to talk about who it's working for. And this is kind of what Collier's talking about, socially embedded development that leads to employment and local control. That's not what we're doing in our current development paradigm. He also talks about Dutch disease or the resource curse. Have you ever heard about this? It's strange. When a country discovers oil, you think that they would get rich, right? But that's not what happens. There's an economic uptick, but then often a few years down the road, countries, this happened with Mexico, they discover oil, right? And it seems like there's going to be a lot of money flowing, but then if you measure 5 years down the road, they're not doing that well. Sometimes they're worse off. Why? It's counterintuitive. Discovering wealth, coal, oil, diamonds, that's supposed to make you rich, right?
It goes for like certain people? No.
It goes to certain people. Well, this does happen, right? What happens if you discover oil in a country that doesn't have a booming, diversified economy? One of the first things that happen is the value of the currency goes up. The peso in Mexico, value of it tripled overnight. What happens to your exports when the value of your currency goes up? All your exports now cost the rest of the world a lot more to buy. So an increased currency, we're always accusing China of keeping their currency artificially low, which is something the US does as much or more than anyone else, right? It's good for exports. When your currency's cheap, you can export more. You're in a poor country, you discover a bunch of oil, the value of your currency goes up, all your other exports collapse. Every single other industry collapses because you can no longer export your goods, your food, your cars, your whatever you're manufacturing, because your currency's too expensive all of a sudden. What happens if you put $100 billion into the US economy? We put that money to work. $100 billion, great. We'll invest it here, we'll invest it there. But what if you're a banana republic? Where's the $100 billion go? Goes into the pocket of the prime minister. What are they going to buy in a poor country if you give them $100 billion? There's no local produce to buy. There's no local goods being manufactured. They import food to start with. They import oil. They start importing cars. Expensive foreign cars that they can't maintain, right? But the money bounces right off the economy. It feeds corruption. It feeds foreign goods. It takes work, very hard work, to convert that kind of money into sustainable development. It's much easier to splurge, to buy votes, to pay warlords, right? So we get much more corruption. If the resources are valuable enough, you'll actually see fighting. Neighboring countries will try to make incursions to get access to the oil or the diamonds. Different factions will be trying to get a hold of the production of coltan or whatever it happens to be. And so the introduction of or discovery of some valuable resource can often just lead to conflict, right? If you don't have a strong tax structure to tax this income and turn it into primary schools and hospitals and job training, the money just goes poof. You need a solid tax structure and enforcement procedure. The countries we're talking about have that? No. So the problem with these resource booms is it's creating a ton of profit for multinational corporations. It's making certain ministers very wealthy. It's feeding a lot of corruption and violence, but it's not going through a strong tax structure to turn into sustainable local development. That's what Collier's talking about. Where there is good governance, where there is a government in control that knows how to protect the forests and can tax the businesses, then we can take the resources from under the ground and convert them into resources on top of the ground, into infrastructure. The money doesn't just go away. It doesn't go to some multinational corporation. Resources from under the ground turn into resources on top of the ground. Development, thick development, local development.
So can we dare to be optimistic? Well, the thesis of the bottom billion is that 1 billion people have been stuck living in economies that have been stagnant for 40 years, and hence diverging from the rest of mankind. And so the real question to pose is not can we be optimistic, it's how can we give credible hope to that 1 billion people? That, to my mind, is the fundamental challenge now of development. What I'm going to offer you is a recipe, a combination of the two forces that change the world for good, which is the alliance of compassion and enlightened self-interest. Compassion, because 1 billion people are living in societies that have not offered credible hope. That is a human tragedy. Enlightened self-interest, because if that economic divergence continues for another 40 years, combined with social integration globally, it will build a nightmare for our children. We need compassion to get ourselves started, and enlightened self-interest to get ourselves serious. That's the alliance that changes the world. So, what does it mean to get serious about providing hope for the bottom billion? What can we actually do? Well, a good guide is to think, what did we do last time the rich world got serious about developing another region of the world? Well, that gives us, turns out, quite a good clue. Except you have to go back quite a long time. The last time the rich world got serious about developing another region was in the late 1940s. The rich world was you, America, and the region that needed to be developed was my world, Europe. That was post-war Europe. Why did America get serious? It wasn't just compassion for Europe, though there was that. It was you knew you had to. Because in the late 1940s, country after country in Central Europe was falling into the Soviet bloc. And so you knew you'd no choice. Europe had to be dragged into economic development. So what did you do last time you got serious? Well, yes, you had a big aid program. Thank you very much. That was Marshall Aid. We need to do it again. Aid is part of the solution. But what else did you do? Well, you tore up your trade policy and totally reversed it. Before the war, America had been highly protectionist. After the war, you open your markets to Europe, you drag Europe into the then global economy, which was your economy, and you institutionalize that trade liberalization through founding the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade. So total reversal of trade policy. Did you do anything else? Yes. You totally reversed your security policy. Before the war, your security policy had been isolationist. After the war, you tear that up, you put 100,000 troops in Europe for over 40 years. So, total reversal of security policy. Anything else? Yes. You tear up the 11th commandment, national sovereignty. Before the war, you treated national sovereignty as so sacrosanct that you weren't even willing to join the League of Nations. After the war, you found the United Nations, you found the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, you found the IMF, you encouraged Europe to create the European Community, all systems for mutual governance support. That is still the waterfront of effective policies. Aid, trade, security, governance. Of course, the details of policy are going to be different because the challenge is different. It's not rebuilding Europe, it's reversing the divergence of the bottom billion so that they actually catch up. Is that easier or harder? We need to be at least as serious as we were then. Now, today I'm going to take just one of those four. I'm going to take the one that sounds the weakest, the one that's just motherhood and apple pie, governance, mutual systems of support for governance. And I'm going to show you one idea in how we could do something to strengthen governance. And I'm going to show you that that is enormously important now. The opportunity we're going to look to is a genuine basis for optimism about the bottom billion, and that is the commodity booms. The commodity booms are pumping unprecedented amounts of money into many, though not all, of the countries of the bottom billion. Partly, they're pumping money in because commodity prices are high, but it's not just that. There's also a range of new discoveries. Uganda's just discovered oil in about the most disastrous location on earth. Ghana's discovered oil. Guinea has got a huge new exploitation of iron ore coming out of the ground. So mass of new discoveries. Between them, these new revenue flows dwarf aid. Just to give you one example, Angola alone is getting $50 billion a year in oil revenue. The entire aid flows to the 60 countries of the bottom billion last year were $34 billion. So the flow of resources from the commodity booms to the bottom billion are without precedent. So there's the optimism. The question is, how is it going to help their development? It's a huge opportunity for transformational development. Will it be taken? So here comes a bit of science, and this is a bit of science I've done since the bottom billion, so it's new. I've looked to see what is the relationship between higher commodity prices of exports and the growth of commodity exporting countries. And I've looked globally. I've taken all the countries in the world for the last 40 years and looked to see what the relationship is. And the short run, say the first 5 to 7 years, is just great. In fact, it's hunky-dory. Everything goes up. You get more money because your terms of trade have improved, but also that drives up output across the board. So GDP goes up a lot. Fantastic. That's the short run. And how about the long run? Come back 15 years later. Well, the short run, it's hunky-dory, but the long run, it's Humpty Dumpty. You go up in the short run, but then most societies historically have ended up worse than if they'd had no booms at all. That is not a forecast about how commodity prices go. It's a forecast of the consequences, the long-term consequences for growth of an increase in prices. So what goes wrong? Why is there this resource curse, as it's called? And again, I've looked at that. And it turns out that the critical issue is the level of governance, the initial level of economic governance when the resource booms accrue. In fact, if you've got good enough governance, there is no resource boom. You go up in the short term, and then you go up even more in the long term. That's Norway, the richest country in Europe. It's Australia, it's Canada. The resource curse is entirely confined to countries below a threshold of governance. They still go up in the short run. That's what we're seeing across the bottom billion at the moment. The best growth rates they've had ever. And the question is whether the short run will persist. With bad governance historically over the last 40 years, it hasn't. It's countries like Nigeria, which are worse off than if they'd never had oil. So, there's a threshold level above which you go up in the long term, below which you go down. just to benchmark that threshold, it's about the governance level of Portugal in the mid-1980s. So the question is, are the bottom billion above or below that threshold? Now, there's one big change since the commodity booms of the 1970s, and that is the spread of democracy. So I thought, well, maybe that is the thing which has transformed governance in the bottom billion. Maybe we can be more optimistic because of the spread of democracy. So I looked. Democracy does have significant effects, and unfortunately, they're adverse. Democracies make even more of a mess of these resource booms than autocracies. At that stage, I just wanted to abandon the research. But it turns out that democracy is a little bit more complicated than that, because there are two distinct aspects of democracy. There's electoral competition, which determines how you acquire power, and there's checks and balances, which determine how you use power. It turns out that electoral competition is the thing that's doing the damage with democracy, whereas strong checks and balances make resource booms good. And so what the countries of the bottom billion need is very strong checks and balances. They haven't got them. They got instant democracy in the 1990s, elections without checks and balances. How can we help improve governance and introduce checks and balances? In all the societies of the bottom billion, there are intense struggles to do just that. The simple proposal is that we should have some international standards which would be voluntary, but which would spell out the key decision points that need to be taken in order to harness these resource revenues. We know these international standards work because we've already got one. It's called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. That is the very simple idea that governments should report to their citizens what revenues they have. No sooner was it proposed than reformers in Nigeria adopted it, pushed it and published the revenues in the paper. Nigerian newspaper circulation spiked. People wanted to know what their government was getting in terms of revenue. So we know it works. What would the content be of these international standards? I can't go through all of them, but I'll give you an example. The first is how to take the resources out of the ground. The economic process is taking the resources out of the ground and putting assets on top of the ground. And the first step in that is selling the rights to resource extraction. You know how rights to resource extraction are being sold at the moment? How they've been sold over the last 40 years? A company flies in, does a deal with a minister, and that's great for the company, and it's quite often great for the minister. And it's not great for the country. There's a very simple institutional technology which can transform that, and it's called verified auctions. The public agency with the greatest expertise on earth is, of course, the Treasury. That is the British Treasury. And the British Treasury decided that it would sell the rights to third-generation mobile phones by working out what those rights were worth. It worked out they were worth £2 billion. Just in time, a set of economists got there and said, why not try an auction? It'll reveal the value. It went for £20 billion through auction. If the British Treasury can be out by a factor of 10, think what the Ministry of Finance in Sierra Leone is going to be like. When I put that to the president of Sierra Leone, the next day he asked the World Bank to send in a team to give expertise on how to conduct auctions. There are 5 such decision points. Each one needs an international standard. If we could do it, we would change the world. We would be helping the reformers in these societies who are struggling for change. That's our modest role. We cannot change these societies, but we can help the people in these societies who are struggling and usually failing because the odds are so stacked against them. And yet, we've not got these rules. If you think about it, the cost of promulgating international rules is zilch. Nothing. Why on earth are they not there? I realized that the reason they're not there is that until we have a critical mass of informed citizens in our own societies, politicians will get away with gestures. That unless we have an informed society, what politicians do, especially in relation to Africa, is gestures. Things that look good but don't work. And so I realized we had to go through the business of building an informed citizenry. That's why I broke all the professional rules of conduct for an economist, and I wrote an economics book that you could read on a beach. However, I have to say, the process of communication does not come naturally to me. This is why I'm on this stage, but it's alarming. Right? I grew up in a culture of self-effacement. My wife showed me a blog comment on one of my last talks, and the blog comment said, "Collier is not charismatic." But his arguments are compelling. If you agree with that sentiment, and if you agree that we need a critical mass of informed citizenry, you will realize that I need you. Please become ambassadors. Thank you.
But what Collier's saying is, if we use the money, if we actually let the people of these countries know how much money they're being paid for their resources, they would be able to develop their own countries. But why don't we do that? We don't want them to develop because we don't want to pay them what the oil's worth. If we actually paid them and the people of said country got what the oil was worth, what would happen to our price of gas? We'd be paying a lot more for gas and oil. So we go in, we bribe a minister, pay the minister $1 million, and we get access to cheap oil, and the oil is sold out from under the feet of the people, and they don't benefit from it. And we aren't fixing this because we make a pile of money on it. I'll post up the video. You can finish it online. See you next time.